My mother-in-law locked our toddler outside in the winter night, saying, "Children need to understand real cold." "Where's Lily?" I asked, finding Margaret calmly drinking tea at 2:47 a.m. My 3-year-old's bedroom had been empty, fever-warm, but no child in sight. Margaret gestured toward the back door without looking up from her magazine. Outside, learning self-reliance. Through the frosted glass, I saw a small shape huddled motionless in the snow. My daughter, in thin pajamas, surrounded by white. The deadbolt was locked tight. "How long?" I demanded, hands shaking as I turned the lock. The thermometer read -12 degrees. Lily sat like a broken doll against the porch steps, no longer crying, barely breathing. 3 hours, Margaret said, checking her watch. She stopped her tantrum after the first hour. Shows she's learning that tears don't solve problems. Her voice carried casual satisfaction, like discussing a successful recipe. Lily's lips were purple-blue. Her skin felt like frozen marble when I scooped her up. No response when I called her name, eyes staring at nothing. I dialed 911 while Margaret continued sipping tea. "She's fine," she said dismissively. "My children survived worse." The paramedics worked frantically. "Core temperature 87 degrees, one announced. Normal was 98.6. They were fighting to save her life while Margaret told them about Lily, sleepwalking outside, and getting accidentally locked out. Her lie came smooth as silk. At the hospital, Dr. Kim stabilized Lily's temperature with heated IV fluids. "Another 30 minutes and cardiac arrest was inevitable," she told me privately. "This wasn't accidental. The frostbite pattern indicates deliberate, prolonged exposure." Margaret played concerned grandmother perfectly for the staff, bringing stuffed animals and speaking tearfully about the terrible accident. But when Rachel arrived from her nursing shift, Margaret's mask slipped. "I told you she was too soft," she hissed. "Coddling creates weakness." Rachel stared at her mother in horror. "You nearly killed my daughter." Margaret straightened defensively. "I strengthened her. My generation survived winters that destroy these weak modern children. Lily needed real hardship to build character." The police interview revealed Margaret's philosophy. She'd raised 5 children through tough love that would be called abuse today. Rachel's younger brother had died at 4 from pneumonia, but I wondered what had really happened during those harsh Minnesota winters. Officer Davis took notes, but explained the legal reality. Without witnesses to the actual locking out, proving intentional endangerment was nearly impossible. Margaret's sleepwalking story provided reasonable doubt. Criminal charges were unlikely without more evidence. I installed hidden cameras throughout our house immediately. If Margaret came near Lily again, I'd have proof. But she was smarter than that. She hired attorney James Morrison and began building a case that I was an unfit father, paranoid and controlling. The custody battle started 3 weeks later when Margaret filed for grandparent visitation rights. Her lawyer claimed Rachel was being manipulated by an abusive husband who was trying to isolate her from family. They painted me as unstable, obsessed with conspiracy theories about a loving grandmother's innocent mistake. Margaret's sister Helen testified that I'd always been jealous of Margaret's close relationship with Rachel. Margaret's pastor, Reverend Franklin, spoke about her decades of volunteer work with children's programs at First Baptist Church. Even our neighbors described her as devoted grandmother who always brought homemade cookies during visits. My lawyer, David Reeves, struggled against Margaret's carefully constructed reputation. She'd spent 60 years building the perfect facade of respectability. Church volunteer, community leader, beloved matriarch who'd raised 5 successful children alone after her husband's death. Who would believe such a woman capable of deliberately freezing a child? Rachel was torn apart by the proceedings. Her mother had raised her alone after Rachel's father died in a car accident when she was 8. Margaret had worked double shifts as a factory supervisor to keep food on the table and clothes on her children's backs. Rachel remembered those years as difficult, but filled with her mother's fierce love and determination. "Maybe you did misunderstand what happened that night," Rachel said to me, after a particularly brutal court session where Margaret's lawyer had shredded my credibility. "Mom has her old-fashioned ways, but she's never hurt anyone. You were panicked. It was dark. Maybe it wasn't as long as you thought." But I couldn't forget the satisfaction in Margaret's voice when she said Lily had stopped crying after an hour, the casual way she'd checked her watch when telling me it had been 3 hours, the deliberate locking of that deadbolt. This wasn't misunderstanding. It was attempted murder. During the 3rd week of custody hearings, I noticed Margaret's behavior becoming more erratic. She would stare at Lily during supervised visits with an intensity that made my skin crawl. She brought strange gifts, winter coats in July, ice packs disguised as toys, books about survival in harsh conditions. "She's planning something," I told Rachel after one particularly disturbing visit where Margaret had spent an hour teaching Lily about hypothermia symptoms, claiming it was educational. Rachel thought I was being paranoid, but Margaret's obsession with cold and endurance was escalating. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source 6 weeks into the custody case. Rachel's childhood friend Emma Hartwell contacted me after seeing news coverage. "I need to tell you about Rachel's brother Tommy," she said, her voice shaking over the phone. "What happened to him wasn't natural causes." Emma had been 7 when Tommy died at age 4, old enough to remember details that adults had dismissed or forgotten. "Margaret used to lock him outside when he misbehaved," she told me. "Even in winter, She called it natural consequences and said children needed to understand that the world was cold and unforgiving. The night Tommy got pneumonia, Emma had been sleeping over at Rachel's house. She witnessed Margaret dragging Tommy outside in his underwear at 11 p.m. after he'd wet the bed. She told him he could come inside when he learned to control himself like a big boy. I watched from the upstairs window as he pounded on the door, but she just ignored him. Tommy had been locked outside for over 4 hours in February weather, just like Lily. He'd developed pneumonia that night and died 3 days later at the hospital. The death certificate said natural causes, but Emma remembered Margaret's cold satisfaction as Tommy struggled to breathe those final days. She kept saying he was finally learning to be tough, Emma recalled. Even as he was dying, she told people that at least he wasn't crying anymore. She made it sound like his death was somehow character building for the rest of the family. With Emma's testimony, we petitioned to reopen Tommy's death investigation. The medical examiner explained that severe hypothermia severely compromised immune systems, making pneumonia more likely and more deadly. Margaret's discipline had directly caused her own son's death 40 years ago. More witnesses began emerging once Emma's story became public. Margaret's former neighbors from 3 different houses remembered strange incidents. The Johnson family recalled Margaret's daughter Susan being locked in the root cellar during thunderstorms to overcome her fear. The Andersons remembered Tommy's older sister Jenny falling downstairs repeatedly, always when Margaret claimed she'd been talking back. Mrs. Valerie Cooper, now 78, had been Margaret's next-door neighbor when Rachel was a teenager. She testified that Margaret had locked Rachel outside overnight during a January blizzard when Rachel was 16, pregnant, and unmarried. Margaret said she needed to understand the cold reality of her choices, Mrs. Cooper recalled. That explained why Rachel had never mentioned being pregnant as a teenager. She'd lost the baby that night, probably due to the hypothermia Margaret had deliberately induced. Rachel had blocked the memory, but Mrs. Cooper remembered finding Rachel unconscious in the snow the next morning and rushing her to the hospital. When I showed Rachel Mrs. Cooper's testimony, she broke down completely. The memories came flooding back. The cramping, the bleeding, the hospital stay where doctors said she'd lost the baby due to complications. Margaret had convinced 17-year-old Rachel that the miscarriage was God's punishment for her sins. She killed my baby too, Rachel whispered, tears streaming down her face. I thought it was my fault for getting pregnant, but she murdered my child just like she tried to murder Lily. The full scope of Margaret's cruelty was finally becoming clear. Dr. Patricia Newman, a child psychologist, testified about the pattern of abuse spanning 4 decades. Margaret used hypothermia as a weapon of control, claiming it built character while actually committing assault. The coldest nights were when she inflicted the most damage, knowing that frostbite and hypothermia would be blamed on weather rather than abuse. Margaret's other children began speaking up once they realized they weren't alone. Rachel's brother Mark testified about being locked in the garage during winter storms. Sister Jennifer described being forced to sleep in the unheated basement whenever she disappointed their mother. Each sibling had thought they were the only target. The investigation expanded when Detective Lisa Murphy discovered Margaret had been married twice before Rachel's father. Her first husband, Robert Thornton, had died in 1962 of exposure after his car broke down in a snowstorm. Witnesses said Margaret had refused to let him back inside their house after an argument, claiming he needed to figure things out for himself. Margaret's second husband, William Cross, had died of pneumonia in 1968 after being locked out of their house during an ice storm. The death had been ruled accidental, but neighbors remembered Margaret's strange behavior. She'd waited until morning to discover William frozen on their porch, then acted surprised and grief-stricken. She's been killing people for 60 years, Detective Murphy told me, using winter weather as her weapon. She's smart enough to make it look accidental, but there's a clear pattern. Anyone who challenged her authority or disappointed her ended up dead from exposure. The FBI opened a federal investigation into Margaret's activities across multiple states. Records showed she'd moved frequently, always after suspicious deaths or near deaths of family members. She'd perfected her method over decades, learning how to inflict maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. Agent Carol Stevens interviewed Margaret's surviving relatives across the country. A nephew in Montana remembered being locked in an unheated barn for 2 days when he was 8. A former stepdaughter in North Dakota described being forced to walk barefoot through snow as punishment for laziness. The victims who'd survived had all learned to never cross Margaret again. Margaret's first victim had been her own younger sister, Dorothy, in 1954. Margaret was 16 when she locked 8-year-old Dorothy outside their family farmhouse during a blizzard. Dorothy died of hypothermia, and Margaret inherited her sister's trust fund from their deceased grandparents. The pattern had started early and continued for 6 decades. Records showed Margaret had collected life insurance payouts on 7 different family members over the years. Each death had been ruled accidental or natural causes, but the financial motive was clear. She'd murdered for money while disguising it as discipline or character building. Margaret's arrest made national news. The media dubbed her the Ice Killer, a grandmother who'd used winter weather to murder family members for 60 years. Psychologists appeared on talk shows discussing her pathology. the need for absolute control combined with the sadistic pleasure of watching others suffer. I testified before the grand jury about finding Lily that night. The prosecutor asked me to describe Margaret's demeanor, the casual way she'd discussed nearly killing my daughter. She was proud of what she'd done, I said. She genuinely believed that torturing a 3-year-old was good parenting. The trial became a media circus. Margaret hired 3 attorneys and claimed she was being persecuted for having old-fashioned values. Her defense team argued that all the deaths were coincidental, that she'd simply been unlucky to lose so many family members to accidents and illness. But the prosecution methodically dismantled her claims. Medical experts explained how deliberate exposure caused the deaths. Meteorologists testified about the specific weather conditions during each incident. The pattern was unmistakable. Margaret had weaponized winter against her own family for 60 years. Rachel struggled with guilt throughout the trial. She'd invited Margaret into our home, trusted her with Lily's care, dismissed my concerns as paranoia. How did I not see it? She asked during one of her therapy sessions. My own mother was a serial killer, and I handed her my daughter. Dr. Susan Martinez, Rachel's therapist, explained how children of abusers often couldn't recognize the abuse as abnormal. Your mother conditioned you to accept her behavior as normal parenting. The mind protects itself by rationalizing trauma, especially when it comes from a primary caregiver. Lily required ongoing therapy to process her trauma. Play therapist Dr. Ann Foster used dolls and drawings to help Lily understand that what happened wasn't her fault. At 4 years old, Lily sometimes still woke up crying about being cold, but she was gradually healing with consistent love and warmth. The trial's most shocking revelation came when Margaret's original birth certificate was discovered. She hadn't been born Margaret Cross, as she'd claimed, but Ingrid Larson, the daughter of Norwegian immigrants who died in the Dust Bowl. She'd stolen Margaret Cross's identity in 1960, after the real Margaret died in a house fire. She's been living a lie her entire adult life, Detective Murphy explained. Ingrid Larson disappeared after her parents died, and Margaret Cross emerged with forged documents. She's not even who she claims to be. The identity theft added federal charges to Margaret's case. She'd defrauded Social Security for 40 years, collected benefits under a dead woman's name, and used false documents to marry multiple men who'd later died under suspicious circumstances. The scope of her crimes was staggering. During cross-examination, Margaret finally showed emotion, not remorse, but rage at being exposed. I gave those children strength, she snarled at the prosecutor. I taught them that the world was harsh and unforgiving. The ones who survived became better people because of what I taught them. When asked about Tommy's death, Margaret remained defiant. He was weak. He would never have survived to adulthood anyway. I simply accelerated the inevitable. Her complete lack of empathy shocked even hardened court reporters who'd covered murder trials for decades. The prosecution brought in families from across the country whose members had died suspiciously in Margaret's care. A cousin from Oregon whose daughter had died of exposure during a camping trip with Margaret. A nephew from Texas whose son had drowned in a frozen pond while under Margaret's supervision. The pattern stretched across decades and state lines. Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne, a forensic psychiatrist, testified about Margaret's psychological profile. She exhibits classic psychopathic traits: lack of empathy, grandiose sense of self, and the ability to manipulate others through charm and deception. She genuinely believes she's superior to other people and has the right to determine who lives or dies. The most damaging testimony came from Margaret's surviving victims themselves. Her son Mark, now in his 50s, described years of winter torture disguised as character building. She would lock me in the unheated garage for days, claiming it would make me tough. I nearly died multiple times, but she said that proved I was worthy of survival. Jennifer, Margaret's daughter, testified about psychological abuse that accompanied the physical torture. She would tell us that if we died from the cold, it proved we were weak and deserved it. She made us believe our survival depended on her approval, and that any suffering was our fault for being inadequate. The jury heard recordings of Margaret's phone calls from jail, where she discussed her plans to finish what she started with Lily once she was released. She'd told another inmate that children today needed stronger lessons than previous generations, and that she had methods that would make Lily understand reality. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. Soil samples from the farmhouse where Dorothy died contained DNA evidence. Insurance documents showed Margaret had increased life insurance policies on victims shortly before their deaths. Medical records revealed patterns of hypothermia-related illnesses in children under Margaret's care, spanning 6 decades. The jury deliberated for 14 hours over 3 days. When they returned guilty verdicts on all counts, 12 counts of murder, attempted murder, child endangerment, identity theft, and fraud, Margaret showed no emotion. She stared straight ahead as the judge sentenced her to death by lethal injection. During victim impact statements, I held Lily while she colored quietly in my lap, unaware that the woman who'd tried to kill her was facing justice. Children don't need to understand real cold, I told the court. They need to understand real love and protection from people who are supposed to care for them. Rachel spoke through tears about the brother and unborn baby Margaret had killed. My mother taught me that love was conditional on obedience, that children were problems to be solved rather than people to be cherished. It took almost losing my daughter to realize how wrong that was. Emma Hartwell, now in her 40s, finally found peace after decades of survivor's guilt. Tommy would be 44 years old today if Margaret hadn't murdered him, she said. He deserved to grow up, to have a family, to experience warmth and love. Instead, he died terrified and alone because a monster wanted to prove a point about toughness. The families of Margaret's other victims spoke about decades of wondering why their loved ones had died so young, so suddenly, so suspiciously. Margaret's granddaughter from her first marriage, now an adult, described nightmares she'd had for 30 years about being trapped in cold, dark places. Judge Patricia Williams called Margaret's crimes among the most heinous ever tried in this court, representing a systematic campaign of terror against the most vulnerable members of society. The judge noted that Margaret had shown no remorse and posed a continued threat to any child unlucky enough to cross her path. Margaret was transported to death row at the Women's Correctional Facility, where she was placed in solitary confinement for her own protection. Other inmates had learned about her crimes against children and made their feelings clear. Even hardened criminals had lines they wouldn't cross. Her appeals dragged on for 3 years, each one rejected by higher courts. Margaret's new attorneys argued mental illness, claiming decades of abuse had warped her judgment. But psychiatric evaluations revealed a calculating psychopath who'd enjoyed inflicting suffering and felt no genuine remorse. The final appeal was rejected by the Supreme Court on a snowy January morning. Margaret would be executed within 60 days. I felt no satisfaction in her impending death. It wouldn't bring back her victims or erase the trauma she'd inflicted, but it would ensure she never hurt another child. Margaret died by lethal injection on a Thursday evening, attended only by a prison chaplain and required witnesses. Her last words were a complaint about the temperature in the execution chamber being too cold. Even facing death, she remained obsessed with inflicting discomfort on others. The house where Margaret had raised her children was demolished after her conviction, the lot remaining empty as if the ground itself remembered the suffering that had occurred there. Rachel and I planted a memorial garden there one spring, flowers for Tommy and all the other victims who died from Margaret's cruelty. Lily recovered completely from her physical injuries, though she required years of therapy to process the psychological trauma. She learned to love winter activities like sledding and building snowmen, understanding that cold could be fun when you were properly dressed and had warm places to return to. Rachel and I rebuilt our marriage stronger than before, united by the shared mission of protecting our daughter and healing from generational trauma. We had 2 more children, a son named Thomas, in honor of Rachel's deceased brother, and another daughter we called Hope. We moved to Arizona where the winters were mild, and Lily could play outside year-round without fear. The warmth helped all of us heal, physically and emotionally. Lily grew into a confident, loving child who trusted that her parents would always keep her safe. Emma Hartwell became a close family friend, her courage in speaking up having saved Lily's life and exposed Margaret's decades of murder. She'd carried guilt about Tommy's death for 40 years, but testifying finally gave her peace and closure. The case inspired new legislation requiring background checks for grandparent visitation rights and mandatory reporting of suspicious deaths involving family members. Margaret's crimes had revealed gaps in the system that allowed predators to hide behind familial relationships. Rachel became an advocate for child abuse survivors, speaking at conferences about recognizing generational patterns of trauma. She helped establish support groups for adults who'd survived childhood abuse, creating the safety networks she'd never had growing up. The Margaret Cross Foundation was established to help survivors of family violence and to fund research into detecting patterns of abuse that span generations. Emma served on the board, along with several of Margaret's other surviving victims who'd found strength in speaking their truth. On cold winter evenings, when snow falls outside our warm Arizona home, I sometimes think about that night I found Lily blue and frozen. But instead of despair, I feel gratitude for my instincts that saved her, for Emma's courage in speaking truth, and for the strength we found to break a cycle of violence that had claimed lives for 6 decades. Lily is now 9 years old, healthy and warm, surrounded by people who would die before letting anyone hurt her. She loves snow days when we visit relatives up north, secure in the knowledge that cold is temporary and warmth is always waiting. She builds snowmen with her younger siblings and teaches them about staying safe in winter weather, passing on protection instead of trauma. Margaret's final lesson was wrong. Children don't need to understand real cold. They need to understand real love, real safety, and that they are cherished exactly as they are. The cycle of violence that had consumed Margaret's family for generations ended with us, replaced by warmth, protection, and the fierce determination to ensure no child ever again would suffer in the name of building character through cruelty.